Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second lesson. Today is going to be a very powerful lesson, and you're going to learn a lot. So you're going to need a pencil and paper, or if you use your laptop or your phone to take notes, have them handy. Handy means ready, because you're going to have a lot of new words and phrases thrown at you. At least I hope so. So let's get started. Now, I introduced the book to you last week, or I'm sorry, last lesson. And so I'm not going to talk so much from the book today, but you will have homework from the book. And we are sort of being guided thematically through the book. And let me tell you why we're doing that, because it's methodical. The main important big subjects are covered, not only speaking topics, but also grammar issues and pronunciation. You have the full panoply. Panoply, Panoply, is a Greek term that means all of its parts, a full complement of language issues, and it's systematic, and this is why I so much like the book. So we're going to look today at work. You can see vocabulary dealing with work. Your homework, which I won't talk much about today, is on the rhythm of English, and then I'll mention briefly discourse markers, but that will mainly be homework for you. I want to focus today on vocabulary and new phrases associated with work. Now, you're going to have homework dealing with the vocabulary bank on page 163. It's located right down here below, right here. And you'll also have attached to them these listening files. So I won't necessarily go through that with you. I'm going to do something else. And speaking of listening files, you had a lot of homework this first class. I'm going to give you less homework now, maybe about half as much. Now, you can, of course, do all of it, but I think I'm going to assign around half of it because I want everybody to stay, current. I don't want people to get very far behind because then you get discouraged. So I'm going to lessen the homework, lighten the homework a bit, because I want people to stay up. Now, again, just as a reminder, if you don't get a chance to do all the homework, don't fret, don't panic. I'm going to cover some of that during the live, and then we're going to talk about that in, sort of dialogues and interactions. All right, so let's get started with work terms. The first thing we're going to look at are bosses. Now, there are a lot of words for boss. Now this is devoted to jobs. You're going to see that here. Lesson 2 with Professor Corton. Now, boss is a general term that you can use in almost every context. My boss is giving me a bad time. That means they're making life difficult for you at work. My boss is on holiday. I don't have to work as hard. But if we want to be more specific, and at the advanced level, we want to be more specific, then I'm going to provide some terms in their most common collocations that you'll want to remember and use. Some of these you obviously already know, but I will add some nuance and flavor that perhaps you might not be aware of. So let's start with manager. Everyone, of course, has heard of manager. The most common collocation would probably be project manager. And you have project managers on building projects, or if you're an engineer leading the group, you're a project manager. I think any IT applications might have a project manager assigned to it. So this is a person who leads a team or a project and a team that works on the project. Now, a supervisor is interesting, because supervisors are generally associated with factory workers or blue-collar workers. Now, a blue-collar worker, a collar, this is a collar on a shirt. I don't have a collar, but an Oxford shirt has a collar. A blue-collar worker is a laborer, someone who works with their hands or is a little bit of a physical laborer. And those are obviously jobs at the factory. Now, a white-collar worker is that a suit, someone who goes to the office. Now, a supervisor, at least in the US, is commonly associated with manufacturing types of companies, and supervisors lead a group of workers, often in a factory. So you have shift supervisors. There are 3 shifts in English. I bet you know what those are. First shift, second shift, and third shift. But they have other names, however. We have a day shift, that's the first shift, 7 to 3, 7 a.m. to 3 in the afternoon. The second shift is the evening shift, so we call it evening shift. That's from about 3 to 11. And then the third shift is known as the night shift, and that's from 11 at night to 7 in the morning. So these are often associated with factories. So if you hear the word shift supervisor, it's not going to be at IBM or Google. It's going to be at a plant that produces Apple watches, because that's where we hear those names. Director, of course, we know about. You can be a director of a play. So if you're a theater director, you can direct a play. A friend of mine is a Shakespeare director. He directs plays that Shakespeare wrote or that were adapted from Shakespeare's works, novels. An executive director can also be someone who heads up a nonprofit organization or a theater or a fine arts facility. Most big cities everywhere in the world have a fine arts or a culture center, and it's not uncommon. Not uncommon means it's rather common to have someone called an executive director of that. All right, executive is something we're going to look at in the next one, because executive has a very high, it's associated with high status. Now in the US, we'll do a bit of politics here. In the US politics, you have 3 branches of government, branches from a tree. You have the legislative branch, which makes the laws. These are the senators and House of Representatives. You have the judicial branch, which is made up of judges in the courts. And then you have the executive branch. And the executive branch is the office of the president. And so the executive branch is something that is quite an inflated, a high position. And we have a very specific term, chief executive. The chief executive officer is someone who is at the top of any organization. And these often referred to as the CEO. You don't hear very often chief executive. You more often hear the CEO is visiting today. CEO. All right, administrator, often we have office administrator. The administrator often is systems or office administrators. So an office administrator is just as what we expect, maybe heading up all of the admin staff, those who answer phones or sort the paperwork, etc., greet the clients when they come into the office. Oftentimes there's one person who leads that, and they're called the office administrator. Now, the employer is different from the employee, double E at the end. So you have an employee, that's the person who works for the employer, and the employer is listed here. And that's another word for boss. So my employer, and that's sort of a metaphor for your company. My employer is downsizing. So if a company is downsizing, they're laying off workers. A prospective employer is someone that you're considering working for. You're going to go through the interview process, and we're going to touch briefly on hiring and firing as well in just a minute. All right, so a prospective employer is a potential employer, someone you're considering working for. All right, then we have leader. Obviously, a leader is another general term that can be used in many different contexts. He's the leader in the group, like amongst his friends, he's sort of the leader. But we have team leader, which is really interesting. Team leaders are often found in apps or small IT projects. You'll have a team leader. And if you do any sort of coaching or working like team building events with your company, they might take you to a campsite and you might have team leaders there. A department head is someone who's head of department. And this is interesting. I'm not sure it's official. I'm not sure you're going to find this on the internet. But in America, we say department head. But interestingly, I have heard more often in England, they say head of department. He's head of department, head of school, or headmaster. But they usually, I hear in the English context, head of department, and in the American or US context, department head. Interesting. Finally, superintendent. Now, a superintendent is often in the US context associated with schools. That's the person at the very top of the school system. So for example, I grew up in a small city. We had one high school, one middle school, and 7 grade school. We call them grade schools. In the UK, you call them primary schools. Now, in a lot of places, you don't have a middle school, but we did. And the superintendent of the school district, so how we refer to it, manages all of those. So the head of the schools is not the headmaster. A headmaster is a British term. In the US, we call them principals with P-A-L at the end, pal, meaning friend, although principals were never my friend, not as a student. But a principal is a head of all, so you have principals that head all the schools, and the school superintendent is then above all of them. All right. Now we have one false friend that I don't imagine you all make very often, but your students, if you're teaching, do. And I just want to mention it, chief, because sometimes in your language, chief might seem like a boss, but it's not. We do not use chief in this way. A chief, in America at least, we often think of a native Indian. So here's a chief in his sort of authentic garb, authentic clothing. But of course, we can use chief in other ways. The chief reason that we're having these classes is for you to improve your English. The chief reason is the main reason. So we can use chief in other ways very appropriately. It doesn't have to refer to the leader of a native Indian group, but it can in this way. So we don't use chief as boss. There are some idioms that we use. They're no longer in vogue. In vogue, vogue is a French word. They're no longer in vogue. They're no longer popular or trendy because it's now considered offensive. But back in the day, we used to say there are too many chiefs and not enough Indians, meaning there are too many leaders in the organization and not enough people following, not enough members, too many people leading. All right, I thought it would be very helpful to look at US versus European names of management hierarchy. Not all of them, just 1 or 2 or 3 that are actually different between the Atlantic, so on the east and west side of the Atlantic. Let's take a look at those. Now, some of these are the same: president, chief executive officer, which, as I mentioned, we say CEO. But in the UK, it's called the COO, the chief operating officer, COO, is referred to as the managing director. And the chief financial officer in a large corporation, the CFO is what we would say, is now in England or Europe is known as the financial director. The chief information officer is known as the IT director in Europe. So just a few names, changes that you should be familiar with. And then at the non-executive level, so the lower levels of the hierarchy, we have junior employee or entry level. This is the newest intake. So if you have an intake, you have a group of new employees who've just started. And then we have what's known as the vice president or head of division. This is sort of a difference. In the US, we have vice president. In Europe, it's most often, well, it can be referred to as head of division, but we generally don't say that in America. Now, the other terms are often the same, But I want to mention just something about vice president, because back when I was growing up, if you were a vice president, that meant you were right under the president. Just like in the US, we have a president, Biden, and a vice president. And Camilla is serving the vice president as sort of his assistant or advisor and substitute when he can't be there. So there was 1-in-1. But what's happened in America, the US, is that we've had a conflation of roles, of titles. Conflation means a growing out of proportion. So now everyone wants big titles. So now we have a lot of vice presidents. It's no longer that special. So you can have hundreds of vice presidents in big organizations now. And now we've invented a term between the president and vice president, the executive vice president. And there can be dozens of these in an organization. And now we even have lots of presidents, president of Europe, the president of this division, president of that division. So now we have a lot more presidents than we used to have. So we have a conflation of titles because people want to feel important. All right, now when you're hired, you have what's known as a probationary period. Now, I'm in Europe, and so in Poland, for example, this probationary period is 3 months where the employer hires you, pays your wages, you get the benefits, but they have the right or the opportunity to let you go. We're going to talk about firing in a minute, to fire you or let you go after 3 months, after 90 days. This is called a probationary period, a testing period. But probation can be used in a few different ways. If you have just come out of jail, you might be on probation. It's this sort of period between jail and free life. Or if you've committed a crime that's not so serious, maybe you've stolen a bike, or you got in a fight or something. So you can be on probation, which means you have to check in with a probation officer, someone who works for the state, and they check on you and make sure that you're okay and following the rules and the laws. And then there's also a probation at school. If you're on probation in the US, it means you've gotten into trouble and you're one step away from being expelled from the school. So on probation is generally associated with high school or middle school. It's a child who's gotten into trouble and they're on probation. So they're one step away from being removed, expelled is what we say in the US. Now, this is an unpleasant topic if you experience it yourself, but a very interesting topic to discuss if you're a teacher and you have students who are adults. So those who have experienced a job, this will always be interesting. So how do we express losing your job? The chapter 1B that you're going to look at for homework discusses a little bit of this, fired and sacked. They'll have 1 or 2 terms that deal with this, but I'm going to go into much more detail with this lesson today. So we're going to look at different synonyms, and I've divided it into 3 helpful categories: formal, informal, and slang. So let's look at them. If you're dismissed, that means you've been fired. But dismissed is it's a softer way of saying fired. Terminated is quite strong. We know about the Terminator, Arnold Schwarzenegger, in the movie. He ends the life of many people. Terminated, of course, means you end your employment with this company. If you've been let go, it means that you've been fired, but it's a softer way of saying let go. She was released from her duties is not so common in my experience. I just want to mention it. But this is a very official way. So if you're looking, if there's a press conference and there's reporters there, you might use this phrase because it's very official. She's been released of her duties as of Monday at 9 a.m. Laid off is a US term. You don't hear this in the UK. Many workers were laid off. They were let go. They were fired. And then finally, a British term, which I didn't know about until I lived in England, made redundant. Now, if something's redundant, it means it's not needed. So if people are redundant, it means they're not needed. And so if you're made redundant, You're let go. Due to the merger, several positions were made redundant. All right, now we're going to look at some informal terms, which are very common. I was sacked. Now, actually, the informal and slang, we have a bit of an overlap. I didn't know quite how to do this. So sacked and axed we'll look at in the slang as well. I was booted. I'm out of work. Now, out of work is interesting because it can mean a lot of things. I'm out of work means you could have quit and you don't have a job. Out of work means you're not working at the moment, but it could indicate that you were fired. And given the boot, now if you're given the boot, you're kicked. So if you're given the boot, someone's kicked you, probably in the fanny, in the rear, and you're now on the streets. So you're no longer physically in the company. You've been given the boot. You're out of the physical office and therefore out of the organization. Booted means the same. Booted or given the boot. All right, so we're going to look at some slang, and there's a little bit of this here. This is a US term. I was canned. This is slang. You might not know about it. A can, of course, is oftentimes cans are what we eat. We have tin cans and we have canned food, corn, maybe olives or beans, things like that. But if you were canned, I was canned yesterday, that means that you were fired. If you were kicked to the curb, this is a very rude way of being fired. They kicked me to the curb. They fired me and they were rude about it. If you were given the axe, an axe is, of course, what we use to cut trees down. But you can also say, I was given the axe. He gave us the axe and he was let go. Sent packing is, I think, a very vivid way because they tell you to pack your stuff and leave. So you're literally, with your backpack, leaving with all your things, never to return again. And this is one thing that's very interesting about the US versus Europe. So if you're sent packing, it oftentimes is literally so. So they'll come to your office and they'll ask you to clean your desk out. You've got 10 minutes to clean your desk out, and they'll have someone from HR come with you. You'll clean your desk out and they walk you out of the building. Now, a lot of companies in Europe fire you, and then they have you work for 2 or 3 weeks. In the US, they didn't trust this system. They felt that you would harm the organization more than hurt it. More than help it. You do more harm than good. So oftentimes they want you out immediately. But I know that in Europe, it's quite trendy to keep people on for 2 weeks or even a month in some cases, or up to 3 months. And so to facilitate, obviously, a transition, if you're a key cog, C-O-G, a key cog in the organization, they want you there for the transition and to train the new person. And finally, I got the chop. Not so common, but chop, of course, is what we do with food. You can see the knife there. I hope that you've not ever been fired, but if it's been done and you can sort of happily talk about it, we might discuss some of these stories during either our live or with your speaking partners. And we'll talk about speaking partners very soon because I'd like all of you to pair up, but we might do that after the live on Sunday. I want to just mention something and maybe we can talk about it. Maybe this will be really interesting because this group comes from literally all over the world, from I think Australia and China all the way to California, or at least the intermediate does. We have people from literally all over the world. And different cultures have different ways of communicating this. And I've lived in different countries, and I find it really interesting in some sort of former, and maybe people in former Soviet countries can verify or not, but I think there's one way of firing people is to ask them to do things they know they can't possibly fulfill. So for example, if they know you're not in a particular country, they'll ask you, if you want to keep your job, you'll need to come into the office and have a meeting on Friday. Now, they obviously know you're not there, and so this is a nice way of firing you, but putting the onus, O-N-U-S, putting the onus on you, the guilt, the burden on you for this. All right, we've thrown a lot of terms at you. Now, the pronunciation is something that you're going to actually do on your own for homework. And this is found in the workbook, textbook. So I'm not going to go through that. It's highlighted the pronunciation, and English File does a great job, and they have a slightly different accent. So I think it's very beneficial to expose yourself, as I mentioned in the first meeting, to a variety of accents and genders. So you're going to have that opportunity. I won't go through that because they do it for us as homework. And then finally, what you're going to talk about is discourse markers. That's the grammar exercise in the book. And I think it's pretty self-explanatory. I will make one observation. I generally don't find ESL students of second language learners using discourse markers so much. We'll take a look at these very briefly. Now, before we get to that, I want to show the most common mistake that I think we all encounter if you're teaching, but some of you might fall prey to this. You might make this mistake. Instead of saying in spite of, people say despite of. This is a very common mistake. Either you make it or certainly your students have made it once in a while. Despite of is wrong, even if it's right in your language, it's wrong in English. So in spite of or despite. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and just share that. We're going to go through very briefly the text in there, and I'm just going to make a few miscellaneous comments about the book. So we've got reading and listening, which will be optional. Here is the speaking, the pronunciation that you will practice on your own. Now, I want to say reading is not required in the class, although I want to draw your attention to these yellow phrases here. These are quintessentially British phrases in many cases. Quintessentially means very exactly, very specially British phrases. So, or especially British phrases. So miss the point is not so much, but fair enough, for example. Fair enough is a very British, common British phrase. I didn't hear this in America. Hold my own is, I think, pretty general. But some of these, like fair enough, is very British. It's very nice to hear these. And you can always tell where people have studied. If you can't catch it from their accents, you can catch it from some of their phrases. And fair enough is definitely British. So I would suggest, even if you don't read the articles, to go ahead and try to make sure you understand what these yellow phrases are, because what I love about the book, they don't pick antiquated phrases or rare phrases. They pick phrases that are a little bit difficult, not easy to understand or not intuitively understood always, but ones that are commonly used. And I think this is the sign of a good book. So oftentimes, if you're a teacher, I'll just give you a piece of advice. I see this with young teachers a lot. And they do this to try to make themselves a little bit more important. And I understand that young teachers need confidence. But I see people giving unreasonably hard examples that they know people aren't going to get. And so they feel better because they have the answer. This isn't a good methodology. A good methodology, or a better methodology, is to give perhaps difficult ones that are within reach of the student's level, but are also common, that they're likely to encounter if they ever go to the country, England or an English-speaking country. All right, I'll intersperse a few methodological points. I do understand that not all of you are teachers, but I do know that some of you are. And I'll make some of these points. I will hold a teaching course at some point later, but I do want to mention a few of these. Now, here is the grammar discourse markers. Linkers is what it's called here, and you can see them, although because consequently. Now, there are, I have to tell you, 4 different categories that I think they're very helpfully illuminated here. I would recommend or encourage that you know very well that you're very comfortable using at least 1 and perhaps better 2 in every category. I don't think it's important to know all of them. I do like to use different ones to mix it up. I will just mention a few things that a few things that you might not hear very often from teachers. One of them, so. I don't hear or see so very often in, especially in writing. It's not as common, but I think it's interesting to use so instead of as a result or therefore. I think it's a nice way of doing it. And you can use it with a comma, because this acts as a coordinating conjunction. And some of you might already know this, but for and so and but are words, and there are a few others yet, that you can just use between two complete sentences and a comma. Now, I'm not going to get so much into this because this deals with writing, and we'll talk about writing on a separate course. But this is, I think, very interesting. When you deal with linkers, those things in the middle, you have to talk about, if you're a teacher, or be prepared to talk about punctuation. When to put commas, when to put semicolons, and when to put colons. Now, I'm not sure you all know what those mean, so I'm going to write those down right now. Here is a comma. We all know that. Here's a period. But in the UK, it's called a full stop. So a period in the US, full stop in the UK. But then you have a semicolon, which goes between two sentences, and a colon, which often then there's a list that comes after it. So I like 3 flavors of ice cream, colon, strawberry, vanilla, and chocolate. You have a list after that. So you have to know, when you're teaching linking words, when to use a comma right here and when to use a full stop or a semicolon. And you're going to see here, I want you just to make a note of it. When they use, commas, when they don't use commas, when they use a stronger punctuation like a semicolon or a period. We won't use colons in this exercise. All right, now if there are any questions about that, I deal a lot in detail with this in a writing class, but because this is speaking mainly, we don't really have to deal with this, but I want to draw your attention to it if you're teaching it, because students might be confused with the punctuation surrounding the linking words. Linking words are those that link two ideas, they can be phrases, clauses, or sentences together. And this is, I think, really interesting. This is going to be your homework. And I won't necessarily interrupt that. Let you all do that. Here is the vocabulary we talked about. Excuse me, I will erase this so we don't. All right. And then, as I mentioned before, here is some of the answers. If you don't know an answer, you're not clear, or if one of the audio files you're not clear about, they're in dark. Audio files are these sorts of, you have the scripts here. The dark columns, the gray boxes again, are the answer keys. I'm looking forward to meeting all of you. Happy studying, and I'll speak to you very soon. Bye-bye.